Wars often start unexpectedly and end in a way totally different from what the sides have planned. The world is at war. Imagine there is no war in our history school book. Then it would be the most dull and boring book in the world. Local conflicts and threats are multiplying. The people just don't care. That's how the wars happen. The issue of survival of human race in case of new global conflict is on the agenda. It was so much weapons that it could have destroyed everybody. Then it became clear that a new format of war must be found. New forms of war are emerging. Information war always comes along with military conflict or precedes it. Information war started when free information exchange became possible. We are under influence, all of us. Information space is constantly changing. Information streams grew tremendously. To my mind, information war only starts. We continue our discussions about Third World War. This threat changes our life. The very issue of survival of human race in case of new global war is on the agenda. These days, when war devastates our land again, we anxiously look through the news feed, and we can't help wondering, is another world war coming soon? All what we see, isn't it the proof, or just a scary prelude? Can it be that this war has already started? If the catastrophe is on approach, what are the signs then? Is there a way to foresee or maybe to profess a war? If we try to analyze which war came unexpectedly, for sure it was First World War. It started as one local conflict with Serbia, but then developed into a global war. And then it entailed Second World War, as well as many other events we are witnessing nowadays. The history of humankind is the history of war. If we imagine that there weren't wars in the history school book, it would have been the most dull and boring book in the world. But is the next World War going to be the third one? Are we good enough with the numbering? We normally use the term World War only for the last two global conflicts of 20th century. Are we right? There is scientific tradition to call world wars only two last global conflicts of 20th century, First and Second World War. Cold War started after the World War II. Should we consider it the third one or not? There is no consensus in numbering the wars. Some people think the Cold War was the third one, which means that the next global conflict would be the fourth. For example, some experts say the Fourth World War is the war on terrorism. Some others don't take Cold War into account, so they are talking about the next war to be the third one. Or they say that the next one is already in progress. I personally think In order to better sort out the numbering and try to count the world wars, we should develop a clear methodology to include or not to include certain conflicts in the list of world wars. We should not consider conflicts, and especially campaigns, separately from each other. Quite often, they naturally run into one much bigger war, which might look, and practically is, quite global. Such big cumulative wars can last for centuries, pausing for years or even decades, and then flashing again. Their consequences are always very important for the world's history and civilization, but then it is quite difficult to recall why it all happened, what the sides were looking for, and why some other sides got involved. The war of Persian Empire against Greece turned into one big, long-lasting war in Europe, Asia, and part of Africa. Many tribes and nations of the Old World got involved. Starting from Marathon battle, it lasted till the campaigns of Alexander the Great, or maybe till the wars of Diadochi were finished. It can be considered as the first world war of antique times. Its result was the Hellenistic world as we know it. Second World War of antique times was migration period, or great resettlement of peoples. The engine of the war was the invasion of the Huns. It moved countless tribes and nations of Europe and Asia off their places. This big war of all against all lasted for more than 2 centuries. Real bellum omnes contra omnes on 3 continents. The result was the fall of Rome and dawn of medieval era. Some historians prefer to speak about world wars of the past times and not of the future. They examine the conflicts which took place before 1914. Indeed, there have been several wars having many features of global confrontation, according to the conditions of respective historic period, as long as civilized world could be taken as a whole. The expansion of Mongols didn't become a world-scale conflict. The Wars of Golden Horde is one unique Euro-Asian phenomenon, not really having much to do with West Europe and Africa. In the year 2016, we have another anniversary of Genghis Khan coming to power. He got into saddle in 1206. His grandson, Batu Khan, who destroyed Kiev in 1240, this way putting an end to glorious civilization of Kiev Rus. So nobody knows what made the Mongols move and what they really were up to. The conflict between Ukraine and Russia started even before the Mongols, even though there were nothing like Ukraine and Russia as we know them now. What happened in early 13th century? Finno-Ugric fringes of Kiev Rus got separated from Kiev. It happened under the rule of Suzdal Prince Andrew the Pious. The next rulers kept up with this secession trend, and it was the beginning of what we today know as Russia. In the beginning of 13th century, Genghis Khan launched a war aimed on building up of one greatest in the world terrestrial empire, the Golden Horde. Hardly he knew that this war would last for centuries. In fact, it is not finished yet. We should remember that the duchy of Moscow was only a province or ulus of Golden Horde. From the point of view of historic perspective, Moscow state was a successor to Golden Horde when it dissoluted in 13th century. There were several states emerged on the territory of the Horde, like Crimean, Siberian, Kazan, and Astrakhan Khanates. The Duchy of Moscow was one of the other Khanates. It emerged from the ashes of the Golden Horde and inherited its system of state rule and political relations. They took it all from the Horde. The policies of Russia are extremely selfish, and these policies don't really have a lot of ideology behind. Actually, they root back to the usual methods and approaches of Mongol Empire. Russia is only using them to strengthen her own positions. The rulers of Muscovy caught up the torch of this war back in 15th century and started to fight for the legacy of Golden Horde. Still now, in our days, this war is still going on in Donbass, Moldova, Caucasus, Crimea. In fact, it is the war to retake the lost lands of the hordes. Time will show whether this war is going to overgrow its current scale. Eventually, it did it already several times in the past. We'll talk about it a bit later. It is just a commonplace to know that Russia is a Slavic state, but actually it is wrong. To be correct, one should call it Slavic-speaking country. Ethnically, Russians are Finno-Ugric people lived on the territory of modern Central Russia. In terms of statecraft, they did have their own reflections, instincts and ideas, this way or another embodied in the Russian state now. But the influence of Golden Horde, of the Mongols, was really very strong. In fact, this influence was decisive. That is why there is big difference how Mongol invasion was taken on that territory, which later became Muscovy and Russia, and on proper Kiev Rus lands, on the territory of modern Ukraine. The people out there, in the northeast, perceived Mongols as ruling, dominating, cementing force. Practically, they accepted the new overlords. The vassals liked their new suzerain, and the benefits they gained on the exchange of this new vassalage. There is no more historic Golden Horde, but it didn't vanish. Neither hasn't ended up the war it was built on. Muscovy inherited many features and tendencies of the Horde, and added something else, of course, like borrowed imperial Byzantinism and well-known trend to make church a part of the state bureaucracy. What else was borrowed? Some half-baked European looks, some old Bulgarian writings, and a little drop of Kiev Rus heritage. Then they added some barbarian cruelty, treachery, and aggression towards the neighbors. And here it is, just typical geopolitics of Russia, regarding the century, social system, and the guys sitting in Kremlin. They relocated 6 biggest industrial facilities from Lugansk, Donbass, to Russia. I'm not mentioning cartridge manufacturing plant and some others. So the question is, what the hell is that? Reparations? Theft? Where is Donetsk factory Topaz, where famous Kolchuga automatic surge jammer stations were manufactured? This facility was also stolen. It is armed robbery and not international relations. When there is only one leader in the country to make decisions, when the populace is basically indifferent, saying, "It has nothing to do with me," then we will have wars. If you don't care that today they torture people somewhere in North Korea, then one day you would probably suffer from the same tortures at your place. Just because this is the way this world is turning round, nobody's going to live in peace. If we are going to forecast our future basing on what happened to Golden Horde, then our future looks quite acceptable, I'd say. Golden Horde dissolved. The empire of Chinggis Khan fell apart because, as Chinggis Khan himself said, there was no way to rule a state a horseback. State power is something that requires well-thought and realistic actions, a lot of logistics and well-balanced policies. Exactly what today's Russia is missing. Every empire comes to its logical end. They don't exist forever. if there are some attempts to hold it together in an unnatural way, like with gathering the lands or uniting the peoples, whatever, it is simply useless. It only leads to dissolution. The legacy of Golden Horde is not too difficult to find. In Russia and in Ukraine as well, state power is organized according to the basic principles of Golden Horde. Divide et impera, divide and rule, graze and rake off. But we should note that in Golden Horde it was very dangerous for a person in a position of authority to get rich. The Great War of Golden Horde, which Moscow still conducts, is one of the major challenges for today's world. The strive to expand and retake is not curbed. The conflicts rooted in this war are not resolved or settled. This restarts the old threats of the Cold War and puts a lot of tension on East European states. It is relatively easy to start a conflict, especially if one thinks he's got good muscles. But then it often reveals that it is not so. That is why one should always think twice before he starts to butt into everything and look for trouble. It is just a shame that in 21st century we see how the ideology and political approaches of 13th and 15th centuries are being, so to say, renewed. It might have seemed that all that useless and dangerous stuff already went into oblivion. But our current situation shows the different. We clearly see the ghost of the past coming back to life. Besides, this war began to overlap with some other chronic flashpoints in the Middle East, which makes the whole situation even more flammable. The ghosts of the past come to life not only because of the whims or wishes of the rulers in Kremlin. Unfortunately, their approaches are very well supported within Russia, since the people out there are traditionally eager to have their finger in everyone's pie. It is quite strange that the rulers of Russian state suddenly became so much interested in the problems of the Ukrainian constitution. European constitutional law experts have already compared the texts of Russian and Ukrainian constitutions, and the conclusion was that the constitution of Ukraine was much more democratic. Yes, we do see our problems, and we are still working on them. But we are not in a position to tell the Russians how they should change their own constitutional law in order to make their country more comfortable. Here is the situation with the Russian populace. Dostoevsky was right once to mention that only a war can unite them Russians. I know perfectly well the way they think. You must be horrified once you realize what they think about us. For them, any Ukrainian would always be a ho-ho, as they used to offensively call us. Russia is the only country in the world where this low-level popular negativity towards the other nations turns into state politics. Another long-lasting war to be possibly considered world, or at least semi-global, was the expansion of Arab Caliphate. Its overall duration is still a question mark. Caliphate expanded for about a century, but if we consider all the wars it generated and the crusades against the Muslims, we come to some 6 centuries or more. If we consider the conflicts which changed the world, then we should first of all mention the Crusades. The theater of war of the Crusades was quite big. It included the territories of Europe, Africa, and Asia. But, on the other hand, only peripheral parts of these continents were directly involved. We see only western part of Asia, southern part of Europe, and northern part of Africa. So the Crusades don't amount to a world war. But if to consider that particular time, we must admit that for medieval people it was a real world war. It was centered at Mediterranean region, which was, in a way, the center of the world back then. From the point of view of medieval people of Mediterranean region, the Crusades were the world war. But hardly it is true from the point of view of the world's history, as we see it now. As we know, the Caliphate was spreading on 3 continents, almost reaching China. It was a very strong state indeed. In 12th, 13th centuries, further spread of the caliphate practically stopped. By that moment, the Muslim state, the Abbasid Caliphate, was already huge, embracing territories from the Pyrenees to Himalayas. And it is a great misconception that Islam was spreading by fire and sword. Another big mistake is to think that the wars of the Caliphate were so-called religious wars. The Great Arab War resulted into building up of a new geopolitical reality called Darul Islam, the land of Islam. Its importance for the today's world cannot be overestimated. If to take into consideration the everlasting tension in Middle East, terrorist threats and such recent developments as the refugee crisis, one might conclude that the Great Arab War is not finished yet. This way we get 4 big, long-lasting wars, which we can, figuratively speaking, call world wars, according to the conditions of the respective times. On top of them, there is one big Ottoman War. It started in 13th century as Seljuk invasions in Asia Minor, but soon afterwards it was going on the vast territories of Europe, Asia and Africa. This war lasted about 8 centuries, making bigger or smaller pauses. The aftershocks of this war, the tension between Greece and Turkey, and the problem of Cyprus. Several today's conflicts are rooted quite deeply in the mess one created by the expansion of Ottoman Empire. We see the problems on the Balkans and in Syria. Such aftershocks influence the world affairs very seriously, so Ottoman War might be another long-lasting global conflict. It fell apart and formed up some minor flashpoints, but no doubt it is still here. Let's be back to European affairs again. Europe has always been enveloped in wars, but once all these conflicts merged into one big European war of 17th century. It was unlamented 30 years war. First time since the great resettlement of the peoples and fall of Rome, practically all European nations got involved in one big fight. 30 years war was, maybe not world war, but certainly one big all-European conflict. However, noting that the strongest powers were concentrated in Europe, and that Europe had certain domination in the world back then, one might say it really was a kind of world war, in the meaning of the term world of 17th century. The majority of the European countries were drawn into that terrible war, the war that had brought countless horrors and sufferings to the continent. The flames of this war actually never went out. Another peace treaty, and soon afterwards just another war to revise it. All the conflicts in Europe, big and small, which lasted practically till 1945, can be considered as one great European war, which is fortunately finished now. Napoleonic wars root back to the profound conflict between England and France. This conflict shaped the whole 18th century in Europe. And so-called Napoleonic wars, or more precisely, the wars of France since the times of French Revolution up to the year of 1815, they constitute one world war. Not only the Europe, but also Americas were involved. And that is why I think it was a real world-scale conflict. There are some historiographic concepts saying that all these past conflicts were world wars, but such approaches are rather metaphoric. Crimean War in the middle of 19th century was a part of one long-lasting great European war. The defeat of Russia in that conflict is being remembered still today, and recalled much more often than in the past years, due to well-understood reasons, of course. Indeed, this story is quite insightful. In the supply chain of Russian army, there was only one uncorrupt man who was not stealing. It was the Tsar himself, Nicholas I, the emperor. All the other officials were the thieves. I think that corruption is the key, especially at the times of war. I mean the corruption in military logistics and supplies. Talking about our country, the corruption corroded our hearts and souls. Great European War was taken up its full global scale 2 times. We know the cases as First and Second World Wars. But it was still the same Great European War that started in 17th century and ended only in 1945. The very concept of world wars is rather historiographic and political, because when these conflicts were in the starting phase, nobody knew that they would acquire global scale. Among the names of the First World War were such titles as Great War, European War, the War of all the wars, or even the Last War. Many people believed that such terrible conflict would never happen again. Like there can be no throwbacks. Humankind would learn the lesson, and this war would be the last one. I personally think that the main reason for these wars was the fact that technical progress resulted in extremely high level of aggression. This aggression overwhelmed Western societies. The progress of human souls was lagging very much behind the progress of technical and military means. In interbellum, or interwar period, many historians, politicians, analysts grew aware that First World War was not going to be the last big war, and another global military standoff would be possibly triggered soon. And they were damned right. Just about 20 years had passed after the First World War was officially finished, and another world war, even more terrible one, started. This new war was almost immediately called the Second, just because there were such expectations in the interwar period. Let's come back to the Great War of Golden Horde and note, when it overlapped with Great European War, the result was World War, both times. Cumulative effect of these two interacting and interlacing wars has twice led to the most terrible military disasters of humankind. Some scientists are prone to follow Winston Churchill, who suggested that First and Second World Wars were one big war. He called it the Second 30 Years' War. The center of the First World War was mainly in Europe, although there were some military actions outside it. But the Second World War was going practically all over the earth, with the exception of America. The majority of the countries took part in it, joining the respective coalitions. This way we could come to an interesting conclusion. The conflicts known to us as the First and the Second World Wars were, in fact, only one cumulative war made up of two historical continental wars. The tragedy of Ukraine, as well as of some other East European states, was to get stuck on the theater of the war of the hordes, of the Ottomans, and of the Great European War. The coalition led by Nazi Germany included such satellites as Italy, Turkey, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, and they all were fighting against the USSR. When the Russians today identify the USSR as Russia, it is very unfair towards the other nations of the USSR. From the point of view of technology, the Germans had very big advantage. Military technological superiority fully belonged to them. But as it happened, the USSR had very big mobilization resource, great consolidation function of the Communist Party, state bureaucracy and ideology, On top of that, what is quite often forgotten by the Russians now, there was great support and aid the USSR got from the West. Soviet Empire was a monster, quite retarded, backward in every aspect of economy and human life, and wearing ideological blinkers. But Western powers decided that this Soviet monster was a bit better thing than the Nazi monster, and they supported the USSR in every way possible, with the finances, technologies, military hardware, industrial equipment and raw materials, food supplies and clothes. They gave everything they could. There is one more global war of the past we should not neglect. Great Colonial War. It started immediately after Columbus discovered America, and soon it took a shape of a fight of more advanced against less developed. For centuries, it lasted in the Americas, in Africa, Asia, and in Oceania, from time to time interacting with big and small conflicts of the Old World. After the discovery of the New World, the colonies started to spread all around the globe. Respectively, every war since then began to have its global, colonial aspect. Great Colonial War is not finished either. It still burns with secondary and tertiary conflicts in the developing world of post-colonial countries. These conflicts are often very brutal, with enormous count of casualties, especially among the civilians. Take the example of Africa. In the past 20 to 25 years, there have been several extremely bloody conflicts in Africa. By the scale and total count of the casualties, they reminded the world wars. One might say there is one big African war, with many countries involved. 500 years long Great Colonial War is no doubt another global conflict. To a considerable extent, it generated today's political and economic map of the world. Great Britain managed to dismantle its colonial system in a relatively peaceful way. The nations formerly included in this system still remain British allies, or still have good and close relations with the Commonwealth. See the difference? When a nation runs away from Russian Empire, it is for good. One cannot possibly imagine Ukraine being taken back to the Russian Empire. Neither Georgia would ever come back to them. Even Belarus and Kazakhstan will not rejoin, ever. Another global war we call Cold War should not be overlooked as well. It lasted for several after-war decades. Berlin Wall became the symbol of it. After the wall was taken down, Cold War was quickly announced as finished. But now it seems more and more that this announcement came a bit too fast. It was anticipated, or rather apprehended, that the Cold War would develop into a hot war. But it didn't happen. Despite some really very tough moments in after-war history, when it seemed that another world war, nuclear war, would inevitably start. Risk level of the nuclear war between Soviet and Western blocs reached its peak several times. This threat was very credible once in the 60s, and then later in the 80s. Any escalation was very dangerous, but the Cold War ended, having never resulted in hot nuclear war. In the historical context, Russia and the USA were never involved in a direct fight. It was Cold War, when there were some indirect fights, confrontations of the puppet regimes, but a straight-line conflict never happened. Both the USSR and the USA were in the possession of highly destructive weaponry, and it had been understood that a direct war between them is just an existential threat for both countries. The experience of the Cold War demonstrates that even when the risk of the war is at its highest, there is a way to sort the things out peacefully through negotiations. This way we have First and Second World Wars of antique times, Greek-Persian and resettlement of peoples. Both of them are finished. Third World War can be called Arab. The dust has basically settled, but some flashpoints are still burning in the Middle East. Number 4. Great Osman War, turned into several residual stress spots, partially overlapping with the flashpoints of Arab War. The fifth one, Great Colonial War. It still exists, hidden deep in Hindu-Pakistani, numerous African and some other spots of tension. Another big war was, and still is, the Great War of Golden Horde. The next two global ones were of cumulative origin, emerged due to overlapping of Great European War and Great War of Golden Horde. Those big conflicts seemed to be finished in 1945. Number 7 was the Cold War. What's next? Number 8? There still exist many local conflicts and direct military standoffs, rooted deeply in the great wars of our historical past, Arab, Colonial, Ottoman. But the Great War of Golden Horde seems to be the most dangerous one of them. Imperial ideology and fight for the lost lands are propelling this war, making it even more dreadful. From the end of 18th century until the present times, Russia had been following the usual scheme of its history, as Ukrainian historian Mikhailo Grushevsky once noted. This scheme is built on the idea that Moscow takes up the role of so-called Third Rome and a successor of ancient Kiev Rus state. But actually it is quite an artificial, far-fetched, made-up concept, because Moscow state is the successor of Golden Horde and not of Kiev Rus. It is just a traditional policy of Golden Horde, gathering or retaking the lands by means of force. There is every reason to stress that the war, which is currently going on in the eastern part of Ukraine, is a direct outcome of this horde-style policy. Some experts analyzing the wars in Ukraine, Syria and Georgia, noting the conflicts in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the problem of Crimea and some others, they do believe that all these flashpoints are only manifestations of one big world-scale conflict. Is it the Third, the Fourth, the Fifth World War? It depends on the historic scale and the scope of the analysis. Is a new world war, maybe the war number 8, possible? Is it going to be another cumulative war, emerging as a result of some unresolved and unsettled conflicts of the past? Or will it come to us as a completely new planetary scale standoff of global geopolitical and geoeconomical powers? Which kind of war it will be? Every big war is preceded by some minor conflicts, contradictions and disputes in international affairs and policy, in economics and trade. But all these conflicts just prepare the ground to a bigger confrontation, possibly to another world war. There are many different views about what the Third World War might be. Some experts believe, and not without reason, that all these new developments, like global terroristic threat or the way Russia fights against Ukraine, are the manifestations of New World War. Some other rightfully underline that a new format of information war we see now is just another shape of the World War. But to my mind, the very idea of another world war is something like Damocles' sword that hopefully would never fall on our heads. If to take the examples of the First and the Second World Wars, I'd say there won't be any war like these in the future. After the Second World War, the nations made a great step forward in the development of the technology of communication and of the means of warfare. So the very conduct of military operations would be very much different. The very concept of armed war was discredited. There already was so much weapon of mass destruction accumulated on Earth that this weapon could have eliminated the life in general. That is why it became quite obvious that there was a need to invent a new format of war. When they say that a new global war is going to be hybrid or information or whatever else, the forms of war, and not the meaning of it, are in the spotlight. Information war was not invented yesterday. It was known in ancient times. During Peloponnesian War, Spartans were telling a lot of offensive lies about the Athens, and the Athens were telling practically the same thing about Sparta. It has been happening in all wars, at all times, and it is still happening today. I don't support the point of view that today's war is so much different, and that in the future we would expect some outstanding revolutionary progress in military conduct. From the point of view of history, there is nothing new, and it fully applies to the phenomenon of ideological war. It always went along with military operations. We do have this information aggression, the war that is currently going on in the world. It is already here. As a rule, information war either follows the combat or precedes it. Undoubtedly, information war is based on certain military technologies. That is what Russia is doing now. They throw in the idea that there is no such nation as Ukraine, and that there have never been such thing as Ukraine history, Ukrainian state, that Russia and not Ukraine is the successor to Kiev Rus, and that Ukraine is just something next to nothing. Information space is constantly changing. The streams of information incredibly grew. Internet became just another battlefield. But in principle, nothing ever changes. The sides of the conflict tend to demonize each other. This way, it is much more easy for us people to hate and to kill. Information war came to the scene when some new possibilities emerged, like the possibility to quickly spread the information, to exchange the thoughts, when the borders between the people and the whole nations began to vanish, and people started to communicate in a much more free manner. And that was the right time to develop new methods and tools to attack the nations, to manipulate popular consciousness. These are the methods Russia is using nowadays. Russia is using the same techniques of information war which were developed earlier. Of course, they refurbished them somehow, modernized, but not too much. Like they use internet more actively now, but it's still the same crap, different bag. The best-case scenario of information war is to cause such an influence of the targeted country that the people out there would meet the invader if he were liberator. In this case, the annexation goes without any single shot, so this option is ideal for an aggressor. The war needs the enemy image. Moscow regime succeeded in it. Ukraine was presented to the Russians as the enemy. Paradoxically enough, they still claim that Russians and Ukrainians are so-called fraternal peoples, but still trigger this war. The aggressive ideology behind that is the idea of spreading the Russian world and incorporating Ukraine into it, willing or not. The very essence of the information war is to take targeted groups down to a specific psycho-emotional state in which they would make certain decisions. The decisions that meet the interests and the intentions of the manipulator. The Russian leaders do have one very specific complex. They really get involved and start to believe in their own propaganda lies. They fooled their populace and got fooled themselves as they began to think this very way. And they cannot get out of this mess because they don't want to lose their public face. That is why many things and features of Russian politics can be explained through psychology. They have an illusion that their Third Rome is eternal, and economic sanctions are only for a year or two. They think they are going to survive the sanctions, still keeping Crimea. We know it is not going to be like this, but they have yet to find it all out. It works for certain groups of people, for the people who are not really interested in what is going on somewhere else, for the people who get contented with the sources of information they have. Such people have very little information and narrow minds, and they themselves become the weapon of information war, the weapon of the aggressor. Without even knowing anything, they become the soldiers of information war. We live under the influence, all of us, like a little child who is under total influence of the parents. We all are under the influence of mass media. So we should be very careful about defining the human nature nowadays. On my lections, I often say that we are not Homo sapiens, but Homo medias. I cannot say we are very much reasonable or clever. Yes, naturally, we are capable of loving or of being aggressive and of many other things. But the question is, who pulls the strings in order to build up the respective psycho-emotional conditions? Who brings the people down to the controlled state? I'm in contact with many friends of mine from Russia, former friends, let's put it this way. We communicate over social networks, and I am astonished to which extent they are, so to say, zombified. And when I start to ask them just to think a little bit, come on, use your brain, is what you heard from your TV possible at all or not? Then they jump to another stupid thing told by Russian TV or a news agency, and it is just a stream of daily lies they consume. And even if I manage to convince the guy today somehow, tomorrow it would start over again. Because today, in the evening, he watched his TV, next morning he switched on his radio on the way to work, then he reads something in the internet. It means that the next day he is taken back to his usual psycho state, ground zero, so he should be de-zombified again. Imagine this. Information means of war, the combats of the information battlefield are really very important. Like in every confrontation, the decisive role belongs to the economy and to technical progress. To my mind, information war is on the beginning now. The world is at war. Local conflicts and threats are multiplying and overlapping. New forms and methods of war emerge, and new kinds of warfare are getting more inventive and detestable. We shall look deeper into this situation in the next parts of our film.